ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we say. My name is Margaret Walton-Roberts, and I'm a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University and with the Balsillie School of International Affairs, CIGI's academic partner. Thank you for joining us at this event, whether you are here as part of our live audience or joining us through the webcast. Following this evening's address, CIGI Senior Fellow Dr. Andrew Thompson will provide brief comments and moderate the question period. Please ask your questions using the audience microphones at the front of the auditorium or through the live chat function on your screen. We will also take questions from our online audience. Please remember to state your name and keep the questions brief. I am honoured and pleased to introduce my good friend and colleague, Professor Alison Mountz, who will deliver the CIGI signature lecture on the asylum and refugee crisis. The lecture is part of a workshop being held at the Balsillie School on managing migration from the margins. As part of the workshop, we will also have a panel discussion tomorrow afternoon at 1:45 on changes to Canadian refugee and immigration politics and policies, and you are all welcome to attend. We are enormously grateful to CIGI for hosting this signature event on an issue that has been prominent in global media, political, and public debate. The ongoing conflicts in the Middle East and Syria have added to a problem that has been apparent for years, but has not, until recently, attracted the political, public, and media attention it deserves. That is the political struggles over the erosion of asylum taking place globally and the provision, protection, and enforcement of refugee and asylum rights under the United Nations Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees. Dr. Alison Mountz is prolific in her academic work, both individually and as a highly generous collaborator with students and fellow faculty. She is a professor of geography, a Canada Research Chair in Global Migration at the Balsillie School of International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier, and the 2015-16 William Lyon Mackenzie King Visiting Professor of Canadian Studies at the Canada Program at Harvard University. And I would also add to that she is the proud mother of a 3-year-old baby boy. And so we're very, very honoured that she's here. Sorry, 3 months, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. They do grow up fast, really. She is also the author of Seeking Asylum, Human Smuggling and Bureaucracy at the Border, which is published by Minnesota. She's currently working on 2 book projects, The Enforcement Archipelago, Hidden Geographies and the Erosion of Asylum, which is under contract with the University of Minnesota Press, and with colleague Dr. Jenna Lloyd, Boats, Borders and Bases, Race, the Cold War and the Rise of Immigration Detention in the United States. Her recent scholarship explores the practices and politics of migration, asylum seeking, and border enforcement. Dr. Mountz's work on asylum, borders, and migration has attracted significant praise. Her first book, Seeking Asylum, was awarded the 2011 Meridian Book Prize from the Association of the American Geographers. It presents a detailed ethnography of the state through careful fieldwork conducted inside and outside of the offices of Citizenship and Immigration Canada. She did this work in the early 2000s and focused on the reaction of CIC to the migrant boat crisis associated with Fujianese migrants arriving on the shores of British Columbia. The book is theoretically sophisticated and empirically impressive. As an ethnography of the state, her book offers an imaginative, intimate, and revealing analysis of the exclusionary practices of enforcement that states develop in response to spontaneous migrant arrivals. Though published before the Syrian crisis, her insights are deeply relevant to it. When reading her book and reading the following words from Seeking Asylum, I could not but see in my mind the tiny figure of Alan Kurdi alone on a Bodrum beach. And I quote here, When states and human smugglers construct tunnels, individuals are resubjectified in the spaces between states. The body is contained and excluded, at once inside and outside the state." End quote. During that moment of tragedy that we all shared this last summer, we also digested the news that Harper's PMO sat on refugee files while people drowned in the Mediterranean. And again, here, Professor Mountz's words resound, and I quote, she says, "Human smuggling precipitates border enforcement, terrorist act precipitates anti-terrorist security framework. Caught up in these processes through countless modes of exclusion is the person seeking asylum." End quote. I am honoured and proud to welcome my friend Dr. Alison Mountz back to Laurier, to the Balsillie School and to CG to discuss the political struggles over the erosion of asylum taking place globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for that warm introduction. And I'd like to thank CG and the Balsillie School for having me here, having me back this year. I consider it a privilege to work with the many engaging colleagues and students who work here in this beautiful building, and it's a pleasure to be back. I also wanted to say that there are many excellent scholars of migration and refugee issues in the room, and so it's great to be here with them, and I hope that they will join the conversation tonight. So you're looking at a photograph of a memorial built on Christmas Island, which is overseas Australian territory. It was built to remember 353 Iraqi and Afghan asylum seekers who were lost at sea during the sinking of a ship that was en route from Sumatra to Christmas Island in 2001. This memorial is a small but powerful expression of the ongoing and tremendous loss of life at sea in what I call the enforcement archipelago. The loss of life at sea is a crisis. It's an ongoing crisis. It didn't start, as we know, this summer. And crisis is also in the title of my talk. What I want to do tonight is to trouble and contextualize the phrase crisis, but to also show just how productive the phrase crisis can be, particularly for sovereign power and its geographical extensions and incursions. While there's no doubt that crises are unfolding, I want to work tonight to reframe what, where, when, and whose crises these are. So, for example, when people talk today about the refugee crisis, it's often spoken of as the EU, the European Union's crisis. But let's be clear, of course, that this is a Syrian refugee crisis, with 4.2 million Syrians displaced, the majority of them displaced and hosted in the region, which is what this map is showing. This is a photograph of Zaatari camp in Jordan. It is full to capacity and hosts almost 100,000 Syrian refugees. As Margaret mentioned, we're in the midst of a workshop here at the Balsillie School called Governing from the Margins, which is aptly titled. With the current attention paid to the Mediterranean crossings, the borderlands are getting more attention in the news. But scholars in border studies and island studies have long been arguing that we need to move these peripheral zones into the center of our understanding of sovereignty and geopolitics. Small or remote places are not inconsequential. On the contrary, they're key to understanding power and struggles over exclusion and entry. For some time, I've been studying the uses of geography and legality to restrict access to sovereign territory and to the rights that people accrue when they land on sovereign territory, including the right to seek asylum. A lot of literature on globalization over the years has located the crisis with sovereignty itself. So the argument goes that states are losing control due to the intensification of global flows, and they've reasserted their power through control of human mobility at the border. I've argued, as Margaret mentioned, that during times of migration crises, states expand their sovereign power and reach through reconfigurations of enforcement. And there's a lot of scholarship in recent years that's talking about the idea that borders are being externalized. They're policed farther away from sovereign territory, detached, they're dynamic, they're on the move. So eruptions of migration crises, such as the one that we're experiencing today, or I should say the multiple crises, are important moments to pay attention to when sovereign power to control migration and mobility expands and more restrictive measures are put into place to control migration and mobility. Boat arrivals often play out as crises in many contexts. This one is a photograph taken from Christmas Island, in part because states would like to choose the refugees that they resettle, in concert, for example, with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees conducting interviews abroad and choosing who to resettle. Whereas people who arrive on boats, policymakers often refer to as spontaneous arrivals. Their arrival is not expected. They seem to be unruly, uncontrollable. So for example, here in Canada, we've had very few boat arrivals in recent years, and the numbers are quite small compared, for example, to arrivals to Southern Europe or Australia in recent years. And yet, with these arrivals, the Fujianese migrants that Margaret mentioned in 1999, and Tamil Sri Lankans in 2009 and again in 2010, each was succeeded by changes to immigration and refugee policies and laws. So small numbers can have very large effects in the form of boat arrivals. Tonight, what I want to argue is that asylum itself is in crisis. Asylum was institutionalized as a tool of global governance to resettle the displaced of World War II. Its legal basis is in the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and the 1967 Protocol that people can travel to make claims for protection based on a well-founded fear of persecution were they to be returned home. So what does it mean that asylum is in crisis today? On the one hand, the search for asylum has intensified. So according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, in 2013, there was a 28% rise in asylum claims globally over 2012. And in 2014, there was a 44% rise over 2013, with the percentage expected to be higher again this year. At the same time, this rise in claims corresponds with an ongoing discursive crisis. So over the last 20 years, since the spike in claims in the late 80s and early 1990s, asylum seekers have been vilified in public discourse as bogus refugees, queue jumpers, and threats to national security. These discursive crises lead to material changes to policy. These are times when the paths to safe haven are blocked and offshore enforcement intensifies, making the crossing more precarious. People take greater risks, and so this often contributes to violence and death along the way. Another contributing factor to the crisis in asylum is the global growth in detention. So more countries are detaining. Those that do detain have expanded their infrastructure and also their criteria to detain. And I'm particularly interested in the offshore expression. Again, the transit routes are places where you see more and more detention facilities being built. So as enforcement extends offshore, we see spaces of asylum and refuge disappearing. So there's a direct relationship between the global expansion of detention and border enforcement industries, the discursive disappearance of the idea of asylum, which is an argument that legal scholar Audrey Macklin makes, here in Canada, actually, and the shrinking of spaces of refuge. So instead of more robust protection, we see more precarity. The main response to migration crises is to try to contain, to build walls, to build fences. We see this happening across the EU now. So prolific is this walling that transnational journeys that migrants take no longer are simply a crossing as the kind of spatial metaphor, but a series of spaces of confinement that people experience along the way. The camp, the ship, the detention center, the island. Consider the irony of what I've been studying in recent years, and this is the construction of detention facilities on remote islands. Says one Monawir al-Saber, who was detained in one of these facilities on Nauru, the detention camp is a small jail and the island is a big jail. All of the island, same jail. I want to get freedom. What I've found in my research on islands is the endless creation of more islands, of more forms of isolation. And so the strategic use of islands is also part of the crisis of asylum. So, what I want to talk about for a little while are some statistics. And there are increasingly activists and scholars who are working to document what are called border deaths. So for example, Sharon Pickering and Leanne Weber, who are based in Australia, have been developing a method to account for border deaths. Similarly, Thomas Speerbauer, who's based in Amsterdam, has a very large project trying to document deaths of people entering into the EU. And last year, Keegan Williams, who's right here, who's a PhD student here at Wilfrid Laurier in geography and also at the Balsillie School, we decided to try to statistically test the claim that increased enforcement increases violence or increases losses of people crossing borders. And so to do this, we designed a mixed methodology to locate, record, and analyze migrant boat losses and interdiction operations to look at these alongside each other. And we created a database using state, NGO, and media reports. We found 217 incidents of boats going down, essentially, and 61, now 62, interdiction operations. So here is what this looks like visually. And here you see the longer trajectory and also what's happening recently with the acute rise in losses. So these are statistics of boat loss incidents by year from 1990 to 2015. And I should say there are 217 of them, which is higher than the number I just mentioned, because for the project we were just doing, we were looking at a smaller window of time, beginning in 2006, I think. So the corresponding number of people lost to match this histogram is actually 25,832 people. Now I want to show you another image, another visual of this acute rise. And one thing that is important to observe about what's happening in the European Union right now in the response to migration is that people are talking a lot about the unraveling of the European Union and its politics surrounding migration and the efforts to have a common asylum system. So we see fragmentation, we see tension among member states as they pursue different strategies. But the response offshore in comparison has been remarkably coherent and coordinated and also very well funded. So here you're looking at Frontex expenditures at sea. And the solid line is the overall expenditure, and the dotted line is the percentage of the total Frontex budget. So you can see how significant that is. You can see dips and rises that reflect various crises along the way. And I'm going to toggle once again between these two visuals so that you can see our findings visually. The acute rise in losses around the same time of the acute rise in enforcement. The geography of these loss incidents, so 96% of those reported occurred around the European Union, Australia, and the US. The most common routes where they happened were in the central Mediterranean, Australia, and the eastern Mediterranean. And the most common countries of passenger origin were from Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, and Syria. And all empirics show that the number of Syrian losses is now rising. So we tested the hypothesis that increased enforcement is related to increased losses and found this to be a statistically significant relationship. Most passengers were from Asia and Africa, supporting the heavily racialized and class divisions characterizing contemporary world bordering. We found a strong and positive relationship between increased enforcement and increased losses, and in Europe in particular, high correlations between the intensity of enforcement and losses. Another way of looking at this is spending in the margins. So between 2006 and 2015, the frames of reference I mentioned earlier, EU member states, through Frontex, which is the coordinating agency of the external border, managing the external border, expended 299 euros overall in operations at sea. Recently, the EU offered 3 billion euros to Turkey to close its borders, which was an offer that was rejected. In 2014, Australia made an arrangement to pay 35 million Australian dollars to Cambodia over a 4-year period to resettle the asylum seekers that it was detaining on Papua New Guinea's Mountz Island and Nauru. And in 2014 and 15, in response to its migration crisis along its southern border, the US has been funding enforcement in Mexico and deeper into Central America to manage migration and step up border enforcement there. I haven't seen a specific figure there, but have seen references to the tens of millions. Of course, this is not solving the problem. We continue to see deaths, particularly, as I've mentioned in the news, are those in the Mediterranean journey. But crisis does a kind of political work. It enables the mobilization of resources. Now, within the enforcement archipelago, by which I refer to a complex assemblage of dispersed infrastructure, people, policies, strategies that are always moving outward to meet people deeper and deeper in the transnational journeys that they're taking to try to reach somewhere to make an asylum claim. In this place, we see these geographical moves. So I mentioned that border enforcement is moving offshore, often through interception. We see also the movement of processing and detention to transit regions, so the externalization sometimes of asylum itself. We see the use of islands to mediate access through distance and invisibility. So within this kind of morass of ad hoc enforcement, you hear a lot in the EU context right now about the building of temporary walls and temporary fences. We see much that is provisional and crisis-driven. So while we think of borders and ports of entry and detention centers as kind of fixed infrastructure, it's remarkable that they're all actually also moving. They're mobile infrastructures. As the border extends outward, certain thresholds become highly productive places where sovereign power is worked through, and islands are one of these sites. Islands have long occupied a prominent place in the geographical imagination as sites of control, experimentation, and exceptionalism. So the project that I've been doing for the last 5 years is called the Island Detention Project. And I worked with a wonderful team of graduate researchers and a postdoctoral fellow as well. And you can see on this map, and I'm about to show you a list in case you can't see well, some of the places, the islands, where migrants and asylum seekers are detained. And I say migrants and asylum seekers because these constitute what policymakers like to call mixed flows. So some people will fit into the definition of a convention refugee, and others would be deemed more economic migrants who are searching for livelihood, survival, work, and so on. So why is detention happening on islands? In part, this is a story about physical geography. So islands are proximate, the islands where detention is happening tend to be proximate to the regions of origin where people are traveling from. So it's a little bit of sovereign territory closer to the region of origin that people can reach to make a claim. It's also related to where boats are intercepted. So you see boats intercepted and people are brought to islands. But over time, the infrastructure develops there to extend detention. And they become places where people are detached from the larger communities that you would find on sovereign territory, detached from legal representation, interpreters, the media. They're kind of hidden places. They're far away. They're harder to reach. Here's that list that I promised, and I've actually underlined our main field sites where we did research. So these islands are fascinating places. They're places with, many of them with colonial histories of occupation, which have led to what Baldacchino and Milne call subnational island jurisdictions, complex governance arrangements to do with the political status of the territory. And so overlaying upon this is the migrant who arrives. And so the individual status, legal status, interacts with the complex status of the island and lays the stage for legal struggle. These are also geostrategic military places where you tend to find bases and therefore some infrastructure that can be repurposed for uses with detention. Briefly, these are the methods that we used for the field research: participant observation, semi-structured and unstructured interviews, and archival research. And I'm happy to talk in our discussion later about the methods. This is not a new phenomenon, the externalization of the border. And I've been working on a genealogy of externalization as part of the book manuscript that Margaret mentioned. And one of the key moments that's referenced in the contemporary development of these policies actually goes back to the late 1970s and early 1980s. And this is work that I'm doing with Jenna Lloyd, where the US was actually intercepting in the Caribbean, Haitian and Cuban migrants and asylum seekers who were coming to the United States by boat. And some of the very same spatial strategies that I'm talking about today happened then. So they used military bases across the Caribbean to detain, including Guantanamo Bay, created a buffer zone at sea, and so on. So these practices move from region to region. And we can think of them as relational geographies. In other words, migrant routes develop, and so does enforcement, the creation of barriers in those routes. Migration routes change, or smuggling routes change, and so some have characterized this as a cat and mouse game. And you see it unfolding very quickly in the European Union in such a dynamic situation that this map, which was published in late September or mid-September by the New York Times, is actually now outdated. The most persistent public policy rationale used to advance detention as a strategy is that it is a deterrent. It's meant to deter people from coming. But research has shown over the years that deterrence fails. Instead, detention and offshore enforcement tend to cause some damage, disrupting livelihoods, separating families, causing distress, and what's been studied as re-traumatization of those who are fleeing persecution. So again, we're back to the idea that greater enforcement intensifies risk-taking. Now, nowhere is this more apparent than in the individual journeys mapped of people we interviewed in the various regions that we are studying. So here's an example. This is based on an interview with a man traveling, ethnic Hazara man traveling from Afghanistan to Australia over a period of several years. He made 4 tries. His first went through Pakistan to Indonesia. He was detained on Christmas Island and Nauru and flown back, and the dotted lines are the deportation routes. His second and third journeys went through Pakistan but ended in Iran. His fourth was similar to the first but went through Malaysia and involved a lengthy stay in Indonesia before he was eventually detained on Christmas Island and then moved to Perth on the western coast, which is where we met him and interviewed him. So this journey shows the incredible time and resources invested, the limbo that people experience along the way, the idea that they cross many borders, use many modes of transit, and experience a proliferating series of spaces of confinement during the journey. This qualitative data affirms some of the more mixed methods and quantitative research that Keegan and I have been doing. Again, the idea that deterrence intensifies precarity and violence, which is a burden borne primarily by migrants themselves. Deterrence policy is one of the most expensive and sustained policy failures governing migration, mobility, and asylum. But the political will for and corporate interests in enforcement remain high, and policymakers are reluctant to face this failure and design alternative policies. So what I want to do now is spend the rest of my time talking a bit about 2 locations, 2 of these archipelagos, one surrounding the island of Lampedusa and one Australia's Christmas Island. So islands, as I mentioned, provide another lens into the crisis of asylum. Although the countries under study have extensive capacity to detain onshore, they're investing significant resources in detaining offshore. So until about 2004, Lampedusa was a site of passage to the EU. People tended to get there. Again, it was a closer bit of territory. You can see that it's close to Tunisia, and enter into southern Italy. They would be transferred to Sicily or southern Italy. So we found that islands went through this trajectory of beginning as a site of passage or transit, and then over time becoming more carceral spaces or spaces of expulsion. And you'll see these spatial patterns repeat themselves in the 2 archipelagos I talk about. A geographical spread of enforcement across the region, the transformation of the island from safe haven to carceral space with the capacity to detain growing, and the proliferation of borders and spaces of isolation, which has the effect of eroding access and creating 2 tiers of asylum. So often people who are detained offshore have, for example, fewer rights to appeal or more mediated access to asylum, and so on. So here's a narrative about one of these journeys, again from Afghanistan, but this time to Italy. From Afghanistan, I went to Pakistan, from Pakistan to Iran, from Iran to Turkey, Greece, and then Italy, part by car, part on foot, part on a rubber dinghy at sea, then inside a truck. I was arrested in Greece because I was illegal. I just called my mother, reassuring her that I was in Greece. I thought that was part of Europe too, so I didn't expect what they did to me. If Greek police catch you, they'll give you a good thrashing. I called my mom. I said, I'm arrived, so don't worry now. We'll see what we can do. As soon as I hang up, it was a telephone booth. I get out, and 2 steps ahead, I'm caught by police. They took us to prison. I did a month, more than a month. There was no hope. I didn't even have the guts to call my mother, because I'd called her sometime before telling her that I was in Greece, didn't I? Here's another narrative, this one by an authority we interviewed working on Lampedusa. He says, basically, they're returned to Libya, even if they're Somalis or Nigerians. So it may happen that these people are coming from Somalia. The journey of hope, as they say, doesn't entail only crossing the Mediterranean Sea from Libya to Lampedusa. Actually, the journey of hope is 2 years long, because those who leave from Somalia have to cross the whole of Africa through the desert, only to arrive in Libya and wait before they can leave. Then they leave, and once they have left, they're carried back again. You can see how that's a sheer madness. And many have called this a revolving door. So people spend time trying to get in, being sent back, waiting, trying to get in. This is a chart showing the interceptions by country of origin over the last couple of years to update, some of how these demographics are changing. As I mentioned earlier, you can see, for example, that the percentage of Syrians is growing. And in fact, again, this would be much higher now. So I've seen recent estimates that approximately 40% of the people crossing the Mediterranean are from Syria. Also, you see high numbers, for example, of Eritreans, Palestinians. Once people arrive, a lot of their feelings are encapsulated by the word ambivalence, which is a word that Mary Bosworth also uses to characterize ethnographic work that she did in UK detention facilities. So people spend a lot of time waiting, and they feel that they're languishing. So here's a young man in detention in Sicily who describes arriving there. He says, there had been some boys staying there for a year and a half, and they had no papers. Staying there for a year and a half doing nothing, that's heavy. Then they moved me here. I waited 1 year. During that time, I could have done a lot of things. 1 year just went by like that. I couldn't attend any training courses that year. I couldn't do a lot of things. So people are very frustrated, and they're also very stressed. And in interviews, they often talked about anxiety and depression and the physical symptoms of these: headaches, insomnia, stomach aches. So here's another young man who's a former detainee who was volunteering and working at a center where he had been detained, and characterizes those who are living there, or detained there still. He says they want to live within the law because it's not good to live like you're a criminal. Nobody likes that, especially when you're willing to work for you, your family, for the place where you're living, but you can't. I mean, they're kept in this uncertain situation, always worried about it. How is this going to end up? Will I become a criminal just because? You're always worried. I mean, that's an inner turmoil for anyone, for any human being. We also interviewed islanders about their experiences of migration and detention on the island. And again, people on the islands went through this trajectory, many participating in civil disobedience in the beginning when detention facilities were first proposed on their islands and started to be constructed, periods of compassion and volunteerism, but also as migration continued and detention continued to evolve and become larger and larger, islands went through their own crises themselves and were profoundly changed. So here's a young male activist on Lampedusa in June 2011, so during the period of uprising, one of those periods of crisis when over 50,000 people arrived on the island. He said things really became unmanageable, unsustainable, because we had 7,000 to 8,000 people in the streets with not even their most basic rights guaranteed. To give you an idea of context, Lampedusa has a population of about 5,000 people. I mean, they were sleeping outdoors, they were leaving themselves outdoors, they had nothing to eat, they had no clothes. Therefore, our organization, together with the parish church and another organization, and lots of Lampedusans too, began doing all we could, cooking, giving clothes. And I think Paolo Cutita, who's a Sicilian geographer, argues that Lampedusa is a mirror that reflects broader national politics around immigration in Italy. And I want to build on his argument to say that islands are also reflective of the global response and struggles therein to migration, alternating between, on the one hand, volunteerism and compassion, and on the other hand, at times, crisis and building blockades. So for example, there was a period when Lampedusans blockaded the port to try themselves to stop boat arrivals. And then on the other end of the spectrum of response, we have incredible dehumanization and invisibilization of those arriving. So this is another worker at the detention facility who said, these people leave no mark, actually, because they're nothing. They're ghosts. They're non-entities. In our system, they're nothing, and they're still nothing. And this kind of detachment, I think, is particularly significant on Lampedusa because Italian authorities have been found to be returning people without properly identifying their country of origin. So, for example, calling Eritreans Tunisians and then sending them to Tunisia on charter flights as a way of dealing with the problem of migration, and also undercounting boat arrivals. So these have been very controversial issues in this context and have to do with the hiding of people and the hiding of information. And some of this came to a head in relation to Lampedusa's boat cemetery, so the place where boats are brought after they've been intercepted or landed. And you can see some of the numbers here from the Ministry of Interior, and that 2010 was a particularly controversial year. So this was after Italy really stepped up in 2009 its policy of respingimento, or pushback policy, intercepting boats offshore and sending them back to North Africa rather than bringing them ashore. And at this time, a group of young activists on the island were sneaking into the boat cemetery to recover personal effects that they could find on the boats. So photographs, articles of clothing, shoes, letters. And the idea was to create an immigration museum on the island to remember those who had passed through, particularly given the politics of erasure happening, for example, in the reporting of numbers. So we see this spatial pattern repeat itself on Lampedusa, the extension of the enforcement archipelago in the region, and now we're seeing that in an even more pronounced fashion. There are lots of bilateral arrangements for return to North African countries, and there's increasing policing very close to Libyan territory, for example, and also into the countries of North Africa, so that movement deeper into the routes that people are traveling. We see the transition of the island, carceral space, the movement of borders, disappearance of people and boats, and also struggles to assist and to locate and to remember. Now to Australia. Australia has been particularly masterful at the use of islands to detain, although it too has extensive capacity to detain onshore. Much of this goes back to 2001, to the MV Tampa incident, where a Norwegian freighter rescued over 400 people who were on a ship in distress and wanted to disembark them at the nearest port, which was Christmas Island. And then Prime Minister John Howard drew his line in the sand, turned this into a re-election issue, campaign issue, and created the Pacific Solution, which created 2 tiers of access and used offshore processing on islands to prevent people from reaching Australian territory. Part of this solution was something called the power of excision, which is shown here in the excised zones on the map. So this was the retroactive excision of Australia's own territory for the purposes of migration. So there are overlapping bodies of law at work in this map. On the one hand, domestic migration law, international refugee law, and maritime law, which requires a captain of a ship to rescue those on a ship in distress. Now, although the Pacific Solution officially ended in 2008, there have been various other solutions put into place. The construction of detention facilities across Indonesia, the construction of the high security facility on Christmas Island, a proposal by Julia Gillard to process everyone in East Timor, which didn't go anywhere. And recently, the reopening, so Nauru and Mountz Island had been shut down for the purposes of detention and now reopened in 2012. And then in 2013, the implementation of Operation Sovereign Borders in an effort to intercept everyone and detain everyone offshore, and not on Christmas Island, which is Australian territory, but on Nauru and Mountz Island. So this is what this geopolitical spread looks like across the region. You can see that there are facilities on sovereign territory, on offshore sovereign territory, and then on non-sovereign territory. This scatter plot is a little bit difficult to see, but if you follow the different shapes, I'm going to tell you what you're seeing. So what we see with the circles is a significant decline in onshore detention over the last couple of years. And we see with the triangles, if you follow them, the significant decline of people detained on Christmas Island. And with the X's, you see them going up. So that's detention offshore. So essentially, people are being detained offshore. This is a photograph of that high security facility that I mentioned on Christmas Island. It's one of 3 facilities. It cost over $400 million to build. And it's very remote, so there are only a few flights that go to Christmas Island each week. They leave from Perth, Australia. They take 4.5 hours. It's very difficult to come or go from the island. The seas around it are notoriously rough. It's very difficult even to approach the island by boat. So there are frequent drownings. And this facility is also expensive to run because very little, for example, is grown on the island. So everything, the supplies, food, and workers even need to be flown in to populate the detention facility. And this has had a significant impact on the island with a population of approximately 1,100. And when we arrived on Christmas Island in 2010, there were about 2,600 people in detention, the largest groups from Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. That number went up subsequently to about 3,000 at its peak. And detention became really the industry on the island. So at first, many islanders opposed detention, but eventually many of them ended up working in the industry of detention, whether directly for the detention facility or in secondary industries such as accommodation for those coming to the island, which was significant because there was a crisis of accommodation. And the island was originally founded by the British Phosphate Mining Company. And this is housing for the mining workers, which was then repurposed for workers at the detention facility. And there was such a shortage in housing that 2 workers would sleep in the same bed on different shifts. And the workers who came in on 6-week or 3-month contracts referred to the island as a prison. And the islanders referred to the workers as prisoners who were doing their time on their contracts. Within the island, spaces of isolation proliferated. So islanders live separately from those detained. People within detention are separated between newer arrivals and older arrivals. And a few years after it opened, the facility was renovated to create more solitary confinement cells. And it became, within the broader national detention system, a punitive space where people who were protesting in other facilities were flown, or people who were on suicide watch were flown. So you can imagine the person who is held in solitary confinement in a high security facility on a remote island, as the island within the island, within the island, within the island. There's scholarship coming out of Australia looking at the effects of remoteness on health and mental health, and finding that the more remote places have greater effects on mental health, and that the longer time in detention also has a greater effect on mental health. So it's important to always think about what's happening to people who are detained in these places. And this is from a field note from one of our researchers, Kate Coddington, who met a man on Christmas Island in 2010 and then revisited him in Melbourne, where he'd been moved to an onshore detention facility. She says, Pradeep, a Tamil Sri Lankan, said that he'd had such destructive thoughts the past couple of weeks, heard voices telling him to hang himself from the fan, from the fence, decided that a hunger strike was the least destructive thing he could do, his first in 2.5 years of detention. He was so depressed that he didn't see other options. To me, this narration, this imagination of life in detention in relation to death, calls to mind scholarship by Judith Butler. She asks, whose life counts as human? Whose lives count as lives? And finally, what makes for a grievable life? And increasingly, as I looked at the data, I saw that people were talking about time in detention as a kind of living death, or a kind of deathly living. Butler argues that if we fail to recognize people's lives as valuable, we therefore fail to be able to grieve their loss. So the politics, many of the politics of struggles over detention and losses at sea have to do with bringing people's lives into view. So once again, in this region, we see the same spatial pattern, the movement of border enforcement and of people detained, the proliferation of facilities on islands and of spaces of isolation within them. The spatial form of the island is reproduced, and spaces of confinement and political struggle shrink to the body. So we see many protests involving self-harm, for example. So, to conclude, I've argued that asylum itself is currently in crisis. States are investing in containment, and these exercises in externalization and detention and the use of islands to deter all contribute to the unraveling of asylum. The enforcement archipelagos that are extending outward are premised on dehumanization and devaluation. The distancing from mainland territory invisibilizes people and the violence that they endure en route. This distancing also mobilizes a politics of fear of distant others. The magnitude of physical deaths at sea and this kind of deathly living in detention shows a failure to recognize the migrant body as human. The geographical moves that I trace offshore also used to isolate and inhibit access onshore, so we don't necessarily need to travel thousands of miles to see these dynamics. What is a detention center if not an island? So there are many remote forms of detention on mainland territories as well, where people are hidden and separated, detached from connections. But of course, there are also limits to the metaphor of the island. We are not islands. People are not islands. We cannot live in isolation. And in spite of their disappearance and distress, people who are detained on islands continue to migrate and to protest and to organize, and they refuse to disappear. So this is a photograph of a group called Lampedusa in Berlin, and they've inspired another group called Lampedusa in Hamburg. And they're people who are themselves mobilizing their histories of island detention to call attention to their plight. And they reject the hierarchy of the EU that has, on the one hand, contributed to their displacement, on the other hand, not recognized them with legal status. And so what they're doing is calling on city residents in Berlin to recognize them and to understand them as part of their community. So through them, we witness the eruption of the margins in the center. Migration and enforcement are not only about relational geographies, but relational politics. Social movements that build on the politics of location and recognition hold the potential to take up Butler's relational politics of loss and grief. So she argues that social and political organizations operate in ways that maximize precarity for some in order to minimize precariousness for others. So our own government's investment in border control makes the lives of others elsewhere unsustainable or even untenable. Recognition of detention and interception as a loss of life in which we are all implicated could lead to a radically distinct migration politics, one that builds on recognition of the relationality of geography, migration, and human life. Thank you. Now, I'm very excited to be joined by Andrew Thompson, who is going to come onto the stage, and we're going to have a conversation with everyone and sit in these lovely club chairs. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Alison. That was terrific. I have 3 questions for you, and then I'll invite the audience to ask questions. The first is, in your research, have you found that the courts in any of these countries are actually challenging some of these policies, and they're checking essentially executive power to create these sites?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is, of course, yes and no, because I'm looking at different sites. But certainly we see very important challenges levied by people, often who are in detention, and that make it up through the system. And there have been findings. For example, there was a finding in Australia in cases by Sri Lankans who were held on Christmas Island, that these 2 tiers of access had to be changed. And so for a while, it sent the processing into chaos. But what we find is a remarkable kind of, almost again, the cat and mouse relational thing happening. So there's a finding, and then there's another kind of creative legal maneuver to move people, to work around those findings. In other cases, courts have upheld these enforcement regimes. So for example, in the Italian case, we see really very sad cases where people who have rescued migrants in distress have been prosecuted as human smugglers, and that has been upheld. Right. So it's hard to answer in a universal way because it varies so much. But yes, I think because they're creative legal measures, the courts become an important place where that battle ensues.
Right. And perhaps just to build on that, and I'm thinking about the case of Guantanamo Bay, where the appeal of that detention center was that it operated outside of U.S. law. And as Margaret mentioned, as you mentioned, we have the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and the protocol that goes with it. Mm-hmm. And it occurs to me that we actually have a real gap in international human rights law, that these sites that you've talked about are really operating outside, of the existing legal regimes. And do you see actually a need for new international human rights law that would somehow cover these territories?
Well, I think I certainly agree with you that, that's exactly, you've hit on exactly the key issue is geography, and questions about where rights are protected, particularly in these in-between or interstitial spaces. So for example, at sea, there have been questions in all of these regions about whether people can seek asylum on a ship. And usually the answer is yes, they can make a claim for asylum on a ship. Then the question becomes, do they have information about seeking asylum on a ship? Or if they're given information, is it offered in a language that they understand? Right. And so, again, all these things unfold in places that we can't see. So it's a great question, and I'm not an international law expert, but I, as a geographer, would hope that that the first line of argumentation would be to not allow states to use geography to undermine their responsibilities to the Convention relating to the status of refugees, which Australia and Italy and the United States observe. But clearly, it's a simple but brilliant maneuver, really, to have two different regimes, one onshore and one offshore, and using that exactly in the case of Guantanamo similarly. And in fact, people call Christmas Island Australia's Guantanamo. And recently I saw a reference to Nauru as Australia's Guantanamo. So I do think there are similar dynamics there and questions about jurisdiction and territoriality.
Right. And perhaps, I mean, just to, again, end on this, I mean, it's easy to get very pessimistic about the international system. Is there any reason at all to be hopeful that things might improve?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I appreciate it. There is reason to be hopeful, and I think people are incredibly resilient, and I find hopeful some of the social movements, the transnational social movements that are going on to contest some of these practices. And a lot of these have to do with a politics of location. So one example that I mentioned was a politics of remembering and memorialization. We saw a few examples of that in the talk, but there are many more. So finding ways, equally creative ways, to reach out to people who are being held remotely, letter writing campaigns, for example, and mapping projects to document where people are. We see those happening in all of these settings. So yes, I think social movements and human resiliency, and also the response of civil society has been really hopeful. Canada, I think, is an interesting example. So here we've seen, we saw a resistance or a slowness to resettle Syrians, and in recent months we've seen a remarkable really wave of change across the country happening at the local level. So in Toronto, Lifeline Syria is an initiative to sponsor people. You see schools, local schools raising funds. Wilfrid Laurier is sponsoring 3 Syrian families. And so I think there is humanity and connection that happens across borders as well, and that there is hope for change there.
Great. Thank you, Alison. I would like to invite our audience to come down to the microphones to ask some questions. And as Margaret mentioned, please identify yourself and keep your questions brief. And while people are coming up to the microphone, I will start with one of our online questions. And this is from a question from a gentleman named Martin from Hamilton. What does the crisis tell us about agency in the coverage of global humanitarian events? How do individuals claim their voice?
It's a good question because I think agency is also at the heart of some of these fights about who gets in. And I mentioned the desire, or the preference really, that states show to resettle people that they've traveled abroad to select themselves. And so in a way, you can see that as a denial of people's own agency, using their own resources to move, to migrate, to enter, to make a claim. And so I do think that struggles over agency are essential. And I think we were talking earlier about the death of the 3-year-old Island Kurdi and the effect that that image had in catalyzing changes, again, in civil society, but also with governments to some of their responses to the migration. And so I think, stories and humanizing stories are always important, although there are also battles over representation, whose stories get told and in what ways. How can they humanize without reducing people to the kind of stereotype of a refugee in need, right? So yeah, I think I've seen some incredible reporting actually on the issue of late. But also a way to address Martin's second question of how do individuals claim their voice. One of the findings of the Island Detention Project has to do with social media and the ways that people who can get access to the internet or to cell phones in remote facilities are using social media and technology to tell their own stories. And so a lot of that story has unfolded, for example, on Twitter and on Facebook. So some of the early reports coming out of the newly reopened facilities, for example, on Nauru or Manus Island, were people talking, just getting the word out on Twitter and on Facebook about what was happening there. Many of them were then, they then had the internet cut off, so that goes back and forth within facilities. But that's, I think, an important way that people are finding a path to tell their own story in their own voice, even though they may not, in other ways, be visible to a broader public.
Right. Thank you. Over.
Hi there. Hi, I'm Jenna Hennebury. I'm the director of the International Migration Research Center, also at Balsillie School of International Affairs. My office is across from Alison. I'm going to ask her a question now. Hi, good to see you. Brilliant, as always, and thought-provoking. Thank you very much, Alison. There's two things I wanted to hear more of your reflection on. Mm-hmm. They're interrelated. The first is, you mentioned something that I've been thinking about for a long time, which is these sort of the way in which this is really, these camps, these spaces are framed as temporary, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. How are these temporary when really people will spend the better part of their lives sometimes in detention? And how do governments justify that framing in the cases that you've looked at? The second and related issue is around this kind of rhetoric of crises that we see. Are these crises, or are these something else? And sometimes I think that, crises are supposed to be these acute moments, these sort of one-off big things that we all respond to because we're in a situation where we can't possibly imagine or cope. But this has become the new normal. So how can we articulate this if not about thinking about crises? And I think that you're actually moving us in that direction, and I appreciate more of your thoughts on that. So,
yeah, thank you for those questions. You've made really important points. And there's a lot of work being done, scholarship being done on what are increasingly called protracted refugee situations, where people are held in, or are in camps that were, as you said, initially meant to be temporary and have become so established and so large and been there for so long that they're cities unto themselves, where people are born and grow up and live for 20 years. And so I think temporary, yeah, it's a good question, because on the one hand we have the establishment right now. When I think of temporary, I think of what I'm seeing in the news today. Yesterday, Sweden announced that it was going to establish more temporarily establish more border control. And again, some of the barriers being constructed in the EU to really divert the crisis, divert the routes, again, were named as temporary. So it'll be important to see what happens, whether the whole idea of the Schengen zone and the dissolution of the internal borders of Europe remains or is over. I think that's yet to be seen. But certainly what I find in so much work on border enforcement now is that temporary is also used, again, strategically. So I mentioned how infrastructure that we once thought of as fixed is moving around. So for example, any place can become a detention facility. If a person is in custody in a hospital room, that hospital room in law is considered a site of detention, or schools can become sites of detention, or we see it's almost like the creep of the capacity to detain. And often that happens in these moments of crisis, which are called temporary. But then they become institutionalized, or they become part of policy and law. And that, I think, relates to your second question around the rhetoric of crisis. And I mean, something I've observed is that crisis is not only it's not only the recurrent theme of news coverage about migration, but it's actually become incorporated into the kind of institutions that work in migration. So the International Organization for Migration talks a lot about crisis migration. So it's almost as though all migration becomes this kind of generalized crisis, the recurrent theme, as you said. And I think it's important, again, to maybe return to the idea of contextualizing crisis and to understand the historical continuity of migration, and to contextualize numbers. So, for example, 800,000 people in the context of the entire population of Europe is actually not that many people. It's much less than, I think, 1%. Sorry, I don't have the numbers in front of me. But, so I think finding ways to sort of speak against the crisis is important. But I've also spoken of asylum as being in crisis, because to me, when I look at all of these things happening offshore, that's one of the things that I think is absolutely kind of failing and collapsing.
Okay. John.
Alejandro Olayo Méndez, doctoral student at the University of Oxford. Thank you very much for your powerful presentation. I have two questions. One is, first one is not a question properly, but it's, could you say more about the governance of these refugee, of these facilities of detention centers? Because I think sometimes it's very easy to kind of like slip or enter into prison dynamics. They really become incarcerated in practice, with gender segregation, with isolation areas. And the second one is, could you kind of like explain a bit more or talk about more about all the money involved? In the US dynamics, I know a lot of detention centers have been outsourced, creating in some way all these, what is so-called the control industry. I don't know if you could say that it's the same in the asylum world. Is that happening in other countries? Because then we are talking about politics. We enter into all this dynamic of who gets benefit from holding people that long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great points. Thank you. At first, I thought you said the governments, but you're saying governance, yeah, of the detention facilities, which you said become more like prison spaces. I mean, certainly, people are confined. They're not having access to freedom, although there are different kinds of facilities. There are facilities, I mean, I showed the kind of, on one end of the extreme is the maximum security facility, and I would characterize as much of the US detention system as being that kind of total security. And in fact, many people in the US detention system of non-citizens are held in state prisons and in local county prisons. So I think this is part of the criminalization of migration and asylum, certainly. And so yeah, and you also brought up the idea of privatization and the private companies that run prisons and also detention facilities, which start to look more and more alike. Yeah, so in the Australian context, right now it's Serco, there are tenders and bids, and the companies change frequently and have their own, mechanisms of governance, and are actually quite an international workforce from what I've observed, particularly in Australia. You meet people working for Serco from all over the world, which is a fascinating dynamic to think of the global movement of workers and migrants into the same facility and how they interact. But yes, I think there are also people writing migration scholarship about how the issue of privatization has been overstated, and that it shouldn't be blamed for governmental policies through which people end up in detention. I know there's a scholar, Michael Flynn, who's done some writing on the issue of privatization. Yeah, so I wish we could have a conversation because you're making good points.
I think we have time for 3 more questions, and I'm going to go to one of our online questions. What are some of your thoughts on the Valletta Summit? Does it reflect the dominant policy responses? That is more Band-Aid solutions from Branca and Hamilton.
Can Branca and Hamilton tell me more about the Valletta Summit? Or maybe I should open it up to the experts in the room, because to be honest, I don't know, I'm not sure of the specifics of the outcomes of the Valletta Summit. Is that the most, is this the most recent one on Malta? In the decision to put, to dedicate significant resources to development, and there was another significant part of it.
Basically, it ties into what you were saying about
Yeah.
and deterrence. That's the sort of underlying theme.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, it is good to think of something other than throwing money at enforcement. I think aid is significant. And on the other hand, I'd also love to see the redistribution of resources towards more robust kinds of legal mechanisms for people to actually migrate. So, I mean, I think that's part of the root cause of the problem here, that, as I said, historically, migration numerically has not changed that significantly. It will continue to happen. But governments have created all of these different proliferating categories of migrants whom they see as desirable and those that they see as undesirable. And so the kind of people who are trying to enter, either for protection or for work, have very few avenues to enter. And the asylum system actually becomes one of those avenues by which they can attempt to enter and stay. And so there's a real, I'd say, mismatch between the need to enter, the need to work, and also the needs, economic needs for workers, and actual legal mechanisms or modes of entry. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the outcome of the Valletta Summit will be, but I think certainly the movement of some of those resources that I mentioned, those incredible resources being placed on enforcement, could meaningfully be moved to other forms of what's often called migration management. That would be more meaningful solutions.
Thanks. My name is Audra Mitchell. I'm a CG Chair in Global Governance and Ethics here at the Balsillie School, and thank you very much for a powerful talk. I wanted to ask, this may be slightly outside of your area of expertise, Alison, but if you could talk a little bit about the impact of climate refugees and climate migrants on some of the issues that you're dealing with. Listening to your talk, it struck me not only that climate refugees will increase the number of people on the move in the near future, but also that some of the islands where people are being detained may no longer be above water in the near future. And that places like Australia, if the climate continues to change the way it is, Australians might be seeking refuge in other countries in the future. So I wondered if you could just reflect a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Certainly, it's important to note that in the same regions where I'm studying the use of islands for detention, there are other islands, island populations that are negotiating their potential movement with the prediction that their homes may one day be underwater. And so we see, again, it goes back to the idea that all sorts of crazy things happen on islands around governance and mobility and immobility too. So in the realm, it's true that it's not my area of expertise, but certainly I've done a lot of reading in the area and have colleagues who are working in the area. And I think it's early to predict right now what exactly empirically will happen with climate change. Certainly there will be climate change displacement, but I don't think we're yet seeing it. at a scale to know what impact it will have. So currently, I think it's important to think about its rhetorical and political value. Certainly, it's something that people identify with, and there have been questions about whether the issue of climate change displacement should have anything to do with the convention relating to the status of refugees and the refugee resettlement regimes, because they're vastly different. That's not, climate change displacement isn't necessarily related, obviously, to a well-founded fear of persecution. So can these in some way be compatible? Should the word refugee be used in relation to climate change, migration, induced migration, or displacement, are some of the things that I think people are asking in the realm of refugee and migration issues. Yeah.
All right, we have time for one more question. Gentleman over here.
Good evening. My name is David Terry. I am here with interest, but without credentials.
Thanks for coming.
You touched earlier on the relative fragility that this crisis is bringing to the European Union. I wondered if you would care to speculate a little bit more, and in particular as to how this situation in Europe will evolve. And in particular, do successful claimants for asylum inherit Europe's mobility of labor privileges? And to what extent do you think that will influence the negotiations between the major influencing nations in the European community with regard to how the situation may finally resolve itself, and whether you yourself perceive that this is indeed an existential threat to the European Union?
Again, questions that I wish we could have a longer conversation over, and that I don't feel expert in answering necessarily, because they are speculative, but questions that are of the most interest to me as well, to observe as they unfold. Certainly, there's an incredibly divergent series of responses across the EU, and that's part of the problem. So you have remarkable openness, at least temporarily, or who knows for how long, in some countries, and the complete opposite in other countries, such as Greece, where it's very difficult to get, statistically, to get asylum. So people are trying to get to Germany, trying to get to Sweden. So I don't know, you're asking me, will the European Union collapse? I don't know. I feel like I'm witnessing it's collapsing at the moment. But I suspect probably what will happen, I mean, when I teach students interested in policies about border enforcement, there was lots of speculation after 9/11 about what would happen, for example, with North American borders. And Peter Andreas is a scholar at Brown University. He wrote this paper. He said there could be three possible ways forward. Either borders will be militarized and much more strictly reinforced, or they will become more open through the advancement of some kind of perimeter around North America, or some hybrid model in between. So it sounds like a cop-out, but I think that's actually the most pragmatic and realistic thing that's going to happen, which is the kind of continuation of the piecemeal regimes and responses that we're seeing, the struggles back and forth. So I guess you've pushed me into talking my way through a response to say that I don't think we'll see the complete collapse of the incredible bureaucracy that is the European Union, but I think we are witnessing significant changes.
So, thank you so much, Alison, and thank you to everyone for coming. Please join me in thanking Dr. Mountz.
Thank you.
So it's my job to sum up the evening, and it's a difficult one. I suppose if I had to do it in one word, I would say challenging. And I'd say that, I think, for two different reasons. I think Dr. Mountz's lecture was challenging substantively and also, I guess, somewhat emotionally. We've heard that the asylum system is unraveling. We've heard of the politics of fear. We've heard of the number of deaths at sea, and I too recalled that photo, I think, that shocked the conscience of the world. But I also think it's challenging in another way. I think that Dr. Mountz argued that there's a crisis going on, and I agree with that. But I think it's challenging in the sense that this crisis could also be an opportunity. I think it's challenging for all of us, folks that have an interest in this area, folks that work in global governance, folks that work in asylum and refugee studies. I think it challenges us to do better. And I think we can do better, and I think we must do better. And I'm encouraged by the fact that there's scholars of Dr. Mountz's caliber working on this, and I'm encouraged by the fact that I genuinely think we can do better in this area. Now, as a housekeeping matter, I just wanted to let you all know on December 2nd, we've got another excellent signature lecture coming up, and it keeps with, I guess in some ways, the theme of the high seas. We're going to be having a lecture on counterterrorism operations on the high seas and why Canada's involvement in that is necessary, and that'll be brought Commodore Brian Santaprea from the Combined Military Task Force will be here on December 2nd, so I'd encourage you to come to that. And so I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening. It's been a pleasure having you here at CG. And again, I'd like to ask you to help me thank our speaker, Dr. Alison Mountz. Thank you.
Anti-terrorist security framework, caught up in these processes through countless modes of exclusion, is the person seeking asylum, end quote. I am honoured and proud to welcome my friend Dr. Alison Mountz back to Laurier, to the Balsillie School and to CG to discuss the political struggles over the erosion of asylum taking place globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for that warm introduction. And I'd like to thank CG and the Balsillie School for having me here, having me back this year. I consider it a privilege to work with the many engaging colleagues and students who work here in this beautiful building, and it's a pleasure to be back. I also wanted to say that there are many excellent scholars of migration and refugee issues in the room, and so it's great to be here with them, and I hope that they will join the conversation tonight. So you're looking at a photograph of a memorial built on Christmas Island, which is overseas Australian territory. It was built to remember 353 Iraqi and Afghan asylum seekers who were lost at sea during the sinking of a ship that was en route from Sumatra to Christmas Island in 2001. This memorial is a small but powerful expression of the ongoing and tremendous loss of life at sea in what I call the enforcement archipelago. The loss of life at sea is a crisis. It's an ongoing crisis. It didn't start, as we know, this summer. And crisis is also in the title of my talk. What I want to do tonight is to trouble and contextualize the phrase crisis, but to also show just how productive the phrase crisis can be, particularly for sovereign power and its geographical extensions and incursions. While there's no doubt that crises are unfolding, I want to work tonight to reframe what, where, when, and whose crises these are. So, for example, when people talk today about the refugee crisis, it's often spoken of as the EU, the European Union's crisis. But let's be clear, of course, that this is a Syrian refugee crisis, with 4.2 million Syrians displaced, the majority of them displaced and hosted in the region, which is what this map is showing.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we say. My name is Margaret Walton Roberts, and I'm a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University and with the Balsillie School of International Affairs, CIGI's academic partner. Thank you for joining us at this event, whether you are here as part of our live audience or joining us through the webcast. Following this evening's address, CIGI Senior Fellow Dr. Andrew Thompson will provide brief comments and moderate the question period. Please ask your questions using the audience microphones at the front of the auditorium or through the live chat function on your screen. We will also take questions from our online audience. Please remember to state your name and keep the questions brief. I am honoured and pleased to introduce my good friend and colleague, Professor Alison Mountz, who will deliver the CIGI signature lecture on the asylum and refugee crisis. The lecture is part of a workshop being held at the Balsillie School on managing migration from the margins. As part of the workshop, we will also have a panel discussion tomorrow afternoon at 1:45 on changes to Canadian refugee and immigration politics and policies, and you are all welcome to attend. We are enormously grateful to CIGI for hosting this signature event on an issue that has been prominent in global media, political, and public debate. The ongoing conflicts in the Middle East and Syria have added to a problem that has been apparent for years, but has not, until recently, attracted the political, public, and media attention it deserves. That is the political struggles over the erosion of asylum taking place globally and the provision, protection, and enforcement of refugee and asylum rights under the United Nations Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees. Dr. Alison Mountz is prolific in her academic work, both individually and as a highly generous collaborator with students and fellow faculty. She is a professor of geography, a Canada Research Chair in Global Migration at the Balsillie School of International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier, and the 2015-16 William Lyon Mackenzie King Visiting Professor of Canadian Studies at the Canada Program at Harvard University. And I would also add to that she is the proud mother of a 3-year-old baby boy. And so we're very, very honored that she's here. Sorry, 3 months, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. They do grow up fast, really. She is also the author of Seeking Asylum, Human Smuggling and Bureaucracy at the Border, which is published by Minnesota. She's currently working on 2 book projects, The Enforcement Archipelago, Hidden Geographies and the Erosion of Asylum, which is under contract with the University of Minnesota Press, and with colleague Dr. Jenna Lloyd, Boats, Borders and Bases, Race, the Cold War and the Rise of Immigration Detention in the United States. Her recent scholarship explores the practices and politics of migration, asylum seeking, and border enforcement. Dr. Mountz's work on asylum, borders, and migration has attracted significant praise. Her first book, Seeking Asylum, was awarded the 2011 Meridian Book Prize from the Association of the American Geographers. It presents a detailed ethnography of the state through careful fieldwork conducted inside and outside of the offices of Citizenship and Immigration Canada. She did this work in the early 2000s and focused on the reaction of CIC to the migrant boat crisis associated with Fujianese migrants arriving on the shores of British Columbia. The book is theoretically sophisticated and empirically impressive. As an ethnography of the state, her book offers an imaginative, intimate, and revealing analysis of the exclusionary practices of enforcement that states develop in response to spontaneous migrant arrivals. Though published before the Syrian crisis, her insights are deeply relevant to it. When reading her book and reading the following words from Seeking Asylum, I could not but see in my mind the tiny figure of Alan Kurdi alone on a Bodrum beach. And I quote here, "When states and human smugglers construct tunnels, individuals are re-subjectified in the spaces between states. The body is contained and excluded, at once inside and outside the state." End quote. During that moment of tragedy that we all shared this last summer, we also digested the news that Harper's PMO sat on refugee files while people drowned in the Mediterranean. And again, here, Professor Mountz's words resound, and I quote, she says, "Human smuggling precipitates border enforcement, terrorist act precipitates..."
This is a photograph of Zaatari camp in Jordan. It is full to capacity and hosts almost 100,000 Syrian refugees. As Margaret mentioned, we're in the midst of a workshop here at the Balsillie School called Governing from the Margins, which is aptly titled. With the current attention paid to the Mediterranean crossings, the borderlands are getting more attention in the news. But scholars in border studies and island studies have long been arguing that we need to move these peripheral zones into the center of our understanding of sovereignty and geopolitics. Small or remote places are not inconsequential. On the contrary, they're key to understanding power and struggles over exclusion and entry. For some time, I've been studying the uses of geography and legality to restrict access to sovereign territory and to the rights that people accrue when they land on sovereign territory, including the right to seek asylum. A lot of literature on globalization over the years has located the crisis with sovereignty itself. So the argument goes that states are losing control due to the intensification of global flows, and they've reasserted their power through control of human mobility at the border. I've argued, as Margaret mentioned, that during times of migration crises, states expand their sovereign power and reach through reconfigurations of enforcement. And there's a lot of scholarship in recent years that's talking about the idea that borders are being externalized. They're policed farther away from sovereign territory, detached, they're dynamic, they're on the move. So eruptions of migration crises, such as the one that we're experiencing today, or I should say the multiple crises, are important moments to pay attention to when sovereign power to control migration and mobility expands and more restrictive measures are put into place to control migration and mobility. Boat arrivals often play out as crises in many contexts. This one is a photograph taken from Christmas Island, in part because states would like to choose the refugees that they resettle, in concert, for example, with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees conducting interviews abroad and choosing who to resettle. Whereas people who arrive on boats, policymakers often refer to as spontaneous arrivals. Their arrival is not expected. They seem to be unruly, uncontrollable. So for example, here in Canada, we've had very few boat arrivals in recent years, and the numbers are quite small compared, for example, to arrivals to Southern Europe or Australia in recent years. And yet, with these arrivals, the Fujianese migrants that Margaret mentioned in 1999, and Tamil Sri Lankans in 2009 and again in 2010, each was succeeded by changes to immigration and refugee policies and laws. So small numbers can have very large effects in the form of boat arrivals. Tonight, what I want to argue is that asylum itself is in crisis. Asylum was institutionalized as a tool of global governance to resettle the displaced of World War II. Its legal basis is in the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and the 1967 Protocol that people can travel to make claims for protection based on a well-founded fear of persecution were they to be returned home. So what does it mean that asylum is in crisis today? On the one hand, the search for asylum has intensified. So according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, in 2013, there was a 28% rise in asylum claims globally over 2012. And in 2014, there was a 44% rise over 2013, with the percentage expected to be higher again this year. At the same time, this rise in claims corresponds with an ongoing discursive crisis. So over the last 20 years, since the spike in claims in the late 80s and early 1990s, asylum seekers have been vilified in public discourse as bogus refugees, queue jumpers, and threats to national security. These discursive crises lead to material changes to policy. These are times when the paths to safe haven are blocked and offshore enforcement intensifies, making the crossing more precarious. People take greater risks, and so this often contributes to violence and death along the way. Another contributing factor to the crisis in asylum is the global growth in detention. So more countries are detaining. Those that do detain have expanded their infrastructure and also their criteria to detain. And I'm particularly interested in the offshore expression. Again, the transit routes are places where you see more and more detention facilities being built. So as enforcement extends offshore, we see spaces of asylum and refuge disappearing. So there's a direct relationship between the global expansion of detention and border enforcement industries, the discursive disappearance of the idea of asylum, which is an argument that legal scholar Audrey Macklin makes, here in Canada, actually, and the shrinking of spaces of refuge. So instead of more robust protection, we see more precarity.